Hello all, I hope you're doing well on this fine, beautiful day. I wanted to take a moment to talk about something that I don't typically talk about on this channel, and that is classic Doctor Who. I have recently, as in today, rewatched a classic Doctor Who story, which is lauded by many as one of the greats. And I have to agree. This story is Genesis of the Daleks. It is a fourth Doctor story, Tom Baker, and I wanted to talk about it not as a first-time viewer, but as someone who's seen it quite a few times. In my appreciation of its grown, I want to talk about why that is today, and also full spoilers for this episode. I know it's an old episode, but a lot of people haven't seen it, so if you haven't seen it, I recommend checking it out, because it is quite good. The reason I really like this episode is because it has really deep implications for what it means to live under fascism and to have this mindset of superiority. And I know that that's something that's kind of done to death. I mean, it's something that we saw in a series like Andor. If you don't know, Andor is a series set in the Star Wars universe about sort of the inner workings of the Empire and a little bit about the rebellion. This story, Genesis of the Daleks, kind of reminds me of that, because one thing it shows in Andor, and this has been pointed out by others, is that under a fascist regime, there is not only a lot of control and a lot of brutality, but there's also a lot of hypocrisy, and there is a lot of internal strife, even among the elites, and no one is really happy under that system. So, in this story, Genesis of the Daleks, it takes place before the initial story, The Daleks, that we see, which is the second ever Doctor Who story back in 1963. You find out a little bit about how the Daleks came to be. There's a race called the Thals and a race called the Khaleds, and the Khaleds became the Daleks. But in this one, you get more of a breakdown of that. You get a little bit of a feel for these two warring camps. In this story, you see this battlefield. There are these two domes, one the Thal dome, one the Khaled dome, these two humanoid races. The Khaled mutants, called Mutos, which I think is kind of a slur, they're kind of out in the wastelands, kind of out in no man's land between the two domes. The Khaled race is obsessed with purity, and the thing about that is these mutants that are put out there in the fields, like, they were the ones who were the victims of this war, and they've been excommunicated from society because they don't want to have these mutants around. At the same time, the Khaleds are themselves destined to be mutated, according to their chief scientist, and he wants to take that form and encase it in a new battle mechanism, and they're called the Daleks. But the interesting thing is, this chief scientist, Davros, he himself is someone who is very sort of scarred and deformed from the war. And I'm not even sure if they say that he's scarred and deformed from the war, but that's kind of the implication, at least if it's not explicitly stated. So he himself has a lot of hypocrisy about that, and that hypocrisy is going to bear itself out later in the episode. Because from the very beginning, you see that the Thals, they are sort of a war race too. They're less of a dictatorship than the Khaleds are, but even in this war, both sides are still prone to brutality. At one point in this episode, the Thals get some intelligence from Davros, which is, Davros is part of the Khaleds, but they get the intelligence to wipe out basically all the civilians. That happens in this episode. Davros does it as a part of a plan, actually, to get the Daleks to take over. It's kind of complicated. This is 6 parts of a story, so it's a little bit complex. Classic Who does that a lot. You get this very convoluted type stories in the show. You have to kind of think a lot to keep up with them sometimes, especially if you're watching them over a period of 6 weeks, as opposed to watching them in less than 24 hours, which is what I just did. And a lot of people do binge these episodes. Back in the day, they did, I think, smash the episodes together and cut out a bunch of stuff to help with the runtime, which I wish they would do more nowadays. Anyway, the Thals are prone to that brutality too. The Khaled race, they are doing what's obviously supposed to be sort of a take on the Nazi salute. They're kind of clicking their heels and raising their palms when they salute each other. And they kind of get that shiny black military garb. They're very no-nonsense, but then you start to see very quickly how much people within their own ranks can get demoted quickly. So, for example, one of the guards allows the Doctor and his 2 companions to escape, And so he's just immediately demoted, and then he's kind of in a different role where he's able to negotiate with the Doctor. So even within that, it's turbulent. Like trying to maintain that hard grip on everything means that there is a little bit of disorder even within what's attempted to be the order. Within that same organization, sort of the scientists that are working on the Daleks, they start to realize that they don't want this to continue. And it's interesting because the scientists who are rebelling, they're not really doing it because we shouldn't be living under this fascist rule. That's not the reason. It's a couple different reasons. One, they still want to end up in these hard exteriors with these very destructive weapons and to, be able to have that upper hand. They don't want to have no conscience. The scientists don't want the Daleks put up to be basically this we must rule everything type group. They don't want them to do that. And also, once Davros starts making it clear that the lives of the scientists themselves aren't very valuable to him, that's what really starts the rebellion. So it is slightly moral, the rebellion, but it's mostly self-interested, and we don't want to go that far. We still want to rule under this dictatorship, but we don't want to go that far. So even then, the morality in the uprising, presumably these people still don't really care about the Thals all that much. It's sort of a situation where they don't want to go too far, but they still basically want to have the upper hand and continue this war. It's very interesting, and I think it's very reflective of how these wars often happen between two factions, as in they don't really have that much of a main, grounded moral approach to it. It's just they have the military mindset, but they just don't want to go too far, quote unquote, in their own minds. The Doctor and Sarah Jane and Harry Sullivan, by the way, are running around trying to stop this, because the whole reason the Doctor's here is because he's trying to avert the creation of the Daleks. Either completely stop them from being created, to give them some kind of weakness, or to find out their weaknesses so he can report them back to the Time Lords. That's the whole reason he's there, because the Time Lords intercepted his transmat beam and sent him back to Skaro without his knowledge, kind of laying the groundwork for the Time Lords' continual interference in the Doctor's life. There's a very poignant scene where the Doctor himself is wondering whether he should wipe out the Daleks, because one of the only options he has left at this point is to destroy the new Dalek embryos, like the infant Daleks that have not been put in cases and have just been made. He has an option to destroy all of them. And he has this very famous speech in this episode where he says, "I doubt whether I should do this, because if someone told you that a child would grow up to be totally evil, a dictator that would destroy millions of lives, could you then kill that child? If I just touch these two strands together, the Daleks are finished. But do I have the right? Because if I destroy an entire race, then I become like the Daleks. I'd be no better than them." Sarah Jane is trying to convince the Doctor, well, wait a minute, you do have the right. Think about all the harm that they're going to cause. You can't compare those two things. And the Doctor's like, well, I do doubt it, So it's this whole speech, and the Doctor himself is questioning this, but even then, he still, in the end, determines that that's what he has to do. It doesn't end up working at the end, but he's the Doctor who doesn't want to kill, but oftentimes he has to. In the previous episode, the Doctor just did that again. The Doctor, in the previous story, there was a Sontaran who was conducting these experiments on human beings, and the Doctor was talking about how immoral it was, but at the end he ended up having to trick the Sontaran and killed him. So just in the same way that the Khaleds are sort of a war military race, and yet there's a moral faction within them, the Doctor himself has had to take a lot of life, but at the same time, he's trying to think in this moralistic way, but he still ends up doing it anyway. Now, it's a little bit ambiguous because he has the two strands that he touches together to detonate the incubation room, but basically he ends up dropping them in a Dalek, ends up accidentally running over them, so it's like the Dalek himself ended up doing it, which, you could kind of read into that as a parallel, too, to say, kind of the destruction of yourself with war. I mean, it's a little bit reading into it there, but not really, because at the end, Davros ends up holding this vote. The rebellion scientists start to take over. They're trying to give Davros an ultimatum, like, hey, you should destroy the Daleks you've already made, we can start over, give them a conscience, and we can continue. Davros tries to convince everyone to stay on his side. They have a vote, and it's really a farce because Davros is trying to get the scientists who are loyal to him to come forward so he can have the Daleks exterminate everybody else. And that's what he does. The Daleks come through and they kill everyone who Davros has determined is not on his side. But at the end, the most ironic thing happens, which is kind of like, I said, the parallel with the Dalek running over the cords. The Daleks that Davros has programmed, they don't understand that Davros is supposed to be in charge of them still. Because the thing about Davros is, it's shown earlier in the episode that he has a very self-preservationist attitude. Not only is he someone who's scarred and deformed, but he wants to eliminate everyone who is scarred and deformed out in the fields, and he's talked about those people in the offhand way in the episode, the people who are out in the fields. In the same way, he himself wants to have that power of self-preservation, even though in the episode he talked about creating other beings that can rule supreme. At the end of the day, he's still a hypocrite. He wants to maintain his own self, because when the Doctor threatens him to turn off his life support system if he doesn't order the Daleks to be destroyed, he folds instantly. And at the end, you realize that Davros is so arrogant that he didn't even think to program the Daleks to make it so that they would obey his orders. He just assumed that since he was their creator, they would obey his orders, but they don't. All the scientists that Davros kept alive so that he could work on the Daleks with them, the Daleks start killing off the scientists because they start doing things without Davros's approval, and the scientists try to stop them from doing that, and they kill all the scientists, and the Davros is like, have pity, what are you doing? And they're like, we don't understand the word pity, it's not programmed into us. And then they end up killing Davros, and he just dies. His hand, with his withered hand, he tries to stop them from doing that, and he's not able to. I mentioned earlier in the episode that the Thals destroyed the Khaled Dome. Davros's plan was to go into the Thal Dome to the elites and tell them, hey, here's information about how to defeat the dome, how to destroy it. Basically, Davros pretends that he doesn't want this war to go on any longer. So he betrays his own people, and the Thals do end up caving in that dome. And after that happens, Davros convinces all the people, the scientists, that the Thals have turned to brutality, and he uses this opportunity to sick the Daleks on the Thals in the Thal Dome. So they go through, start destroying everybody in the Thal Dome, and then the Thals have a faction of people that rise up to try to go in and defeat the Khalids again. So it's very messy, They end up going through there and caving in the entrance to the laboratory where the Khalids and Davros are working. So what they end up doing is trapping Davros and the Daleks and the scientists in this little room, and basically the Daleks use this opportunity to destroy Davros and the scientists, and they say, well, we'll emerge later. The Doctor has gone in there and not prevented anything. All he's done is delayed the Daleks, and they're going to emerge later, and presumably when they emerge, that's sort of the beginning of the initial story we see the Daleks back in the day. And it's really fascinating because in Classic Who, if you don't know, the way time usually worked in Classic Who was that you could change the circumstances of an event in the past, but you could never rewrite it. You could never stop something from happening. If you tried to stop it, it would just work itself out somehow. And that's basically how this worked, and it's ironic because it's the first Doctor who kind of laid that out during a story called The Reign of Terror, but it's a first Doctor story as well, the Daleks. The first Doctor is the one who said, you can't rewrite history, not one line, So it kind of all worked itself out, but at the end the Doctor says, I realize that out of the evil of the Daleks comes a lot of good. And the Doctor says that a lot of good is going to come out of that because if you remember when he was giving that speech, I don't know if I actually mentioned this or not, but when he's giving that speech when he's getting ready to destroy the Daleks with the two wires, and he's saying he questions it, he says there are whole societies who will form alliances because of the Daleks. There are whole societies who form alliances just because of the fear of what the Daleks are doing. He determines that a lot of good will come out of that. He, earlier in the episode, was talking to Davros because Davros was threatening to torture his friends if he didn't tell him in the future how the Daleks got defeated all these times, and they have to go through and destroy that tape. There's a lot of things that happen in this episode that are kind of all intertwined. It's kind of crazy when you watch Classic Who and it makes sense while you're watching it, and you're watching all the episodes together. Then you're trying to explain the story later, and it's like, wow, that was convoluted. But all of this madness and silliness Actually, there's not a lot of silliness in this episode. Classic Who's kind of known for its silliness, but this story is pretty straight, actually. There's not a whole lot of humor in there. Some of the humor comes when the doctor's being questioned initially by the Khaleds, and he's like being very insolent and very arrogant with what he's saying to them. But it doesn't really last long. There's not a ton of comic relief in the story. Toward the end, there's almost none. What I'm finding through all this story is that the writing is very solid. I mean, I've never really watched all 6 episodes together so close, and all the themes in there, all the subtleties, all the hypocrisies, and all the ways that they show that under fascism, there's so much unhappiness and there's so much restlessness, and you can never really have peace. You can never really have happiness under that system. Like, it's just really shown very strongly throughout that whole thing. And you got to keep in mind, this is written in the 1970s, so World War II was not really that far off. I mean, it's the 2020s now, so this would be like if World War II was like in the 90s. You know, it wasn't that far off. It's really fascinating to watch. I think it's a very solid story. I do wish it had been 4 parts instead of 6, because I think it did get a little long. But one really great thing about Classic Who is just you get so much better of an understanding of the story, so much of the plot surrounding the side characters, the supporting characters, you could say, is so much more fleshed out. You understand all the characters' motivations a lot better. There's a character in the story called Niter, who's basically Davros's right-hand man, and you get this whole subplot going on where they have to, the rebellion has to try to rally support around them, and Niter is a spy and tries to trick them into telling the names of the rebels, basically, and he is able to do that. And it's a very menacing scene where Davros is kind of sitting in the corner just listening, and Niter is in there, and it's like in this really weird, like, dark room, and he's like, let's have their meeting with the rebels. And then he goes, "Thank you, that's what I needed to know." And then Davros comes in and he goes, "This information will be most helpful." And then the guy gets clubbed over the back of the head. It's just like, Davros and Niter have this conversation where they're talking about what they're going to do with him. They're like, "Oh yeah, we'll just do like a brain surgery on him so that we can still use his knowledge. We can't really kill him, but we're still going to use his knowledge, and we'll basically make him like a little robot that we're," it's really dark stuff, But I mean, it's the same sort of stuff you see in Andor, where it's like, we would like to force our hand here and be brutal, but we kind of need people. That's the problem when you have this iron fist way of ruling under a fascist dictatorship, because you need people to serve you in order to maintain that dictatorship, but at the same time, when you do that to people, they tend to get rebellious, Like, if you try to treat people in your own ranks brutally, they will turn their back on you sometimes. And it's hard to do, and you have to do all these things to maintain that control, and it requires betrayal of people who have been serving you, and it's so messy and it's so awful. You never want that kind of ruling in your country. You never want that. It's so unstable, and it just harms everybody, and it's just... I think this story just showed that so well. Coming out in the 70s, having the advantage of both having pretty lax regulations with what kind of evil you could get away with showing in Doctor Who at the time, and then also at the same time having World War II be in such recent memory. Like, it's such a unique, interesting take on Doctor Who, and I think if you haven't seen it, it's worth checking out. It is a little long sometimes, there is a little bit of back and forth. It does have a bit of that going. It's not the worst. Like, every time that someone gets captured and set free, there is like a new piece of information you learn or something that progresses the story. So it's not like some of the other Classic Who stories where you just feel like people are getting captured and set free over and over and over again, and it just feels like it's not progressing the story at all. The story does progress. It's a good one. I didn't appreciate it nearly as much the first time I watched it. If you do have the appreciation for the stories and the tolerance of some of the slowness of Classic Who to sit and watch all 6, it really does help drive home the points of the story and how smart the writing is. And while I definitely prefer the format of New Who, I think for your run-of-the-mill episodes, I do prefer the format of just like one 45-minute episode. It's not going to be the same as Classic Who with really understanding the intricacies of what the writers are trying to show you, where they have so much more time. Like, you just really can't replicate that in 45 minutes versus this, where you have 2.5 hours for a story, which is like a long movie. It's a really different take on it, I think. That's Doctor Who, Genesis of the Daleks. Let me know what you thought of this story in the comments. And if I should review another Classic Who story, because I don't know if I've ever actually done a Classic Who review. It's kind of nice that I'm starting with such a classic story. Anyway, talk to you guys later. Have a good day. Allons-y.